The streets of Atlanta hummed quietly under the soft amber glow of the morning sun. Malcolm Bennett pedaled steadily through the crisp autumn air, his basket brimming with warm loaves of freshly baked bread. His route was familiar, yet each stop carried a sense of purpose. This wasn't just work for Malcolm. It was a chance to remind people that kindness still existed. As he approached the park, his eyes caught a familiar figure, Mrs. Eunice Walker, a frail elderly woman who had made the park bench her sanctuary. She sat with her shoulders hunched against the cold, her thin coat doing little to shield her from the morning chill. Malcolm slowed to a stop, dismounted his bicycle, and retrieved a loaf from his basket. "Good morning, Mrs. Eunice," he said warmly, holding out the bread. Her face lit up as she accepted it with trembling hands. "Oh, Malcolm, you've done it again," she said, her voice heavy with gratitude. "You're always looking out for me. Thank you." "It's nothing, Mrs. Eunice," Malcolm replied with a small smile. "You take care of yourself, okay?" Before he could turn back to his bike, a passerby, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in business casual, paused and glanced between Malcolm and the bread. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone more puzzled than accusatory. "Are you just giving that away?" "Yes," Malcolm replied simply, his voice steady. "She needs it more than I do." The man hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond. After a moment, he nodded and walked away, leaving Malcolm to his work. Mrs. Eunice watched the scene unfold and shook her head gently. "You've got a rare heart, Malcolm," she said softly. "Don't let the world take that from you." Malcolm's story is one of quiet heroism, where kindness speaks louder than words. But what lies ahead will challenge his resolve and prove that even the smallest acts of generosity can ripple through an entire community. Before we dive deeper, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What does kindness mean to you? Share your ideas in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay with us for more inspiring stories. Together, let's spread the message that hope and humanity still matter. Let's dive into this story. The morning in Atlanta stirred quietly as the city prepared for another bustling day. In the south side of the city, where modest homes and aging apartments lined the streets, the world seemed to wake a little slower. Malcolm Bennett's neighborhood was no stranger to hardship, but it carried a heartbeat of resilience. Children played basketball on the cracked pavement, their laughter echoing through the alleys. Neighbors leaned on balconies, trading early morning greetings over steaming cups of coffee, while an older man across the street sat on his porch, whistling a soulful tune. Malcolm lived in a small, worn-down apartment on the second floor of a building that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the walls, and the windows rattled faintly in the breeze. Inside, his space was sparse but tidy, a reflection of a man who owned little but valued everything. A single photograph sat on a cluttered dresser, his mother smiling, holding a young Malcolm close. The alarm buzzed at 4 a.m. sharp, and Malcolm stirred. He stretched, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and rose from his narrow bed. There was no time to linger. The day waited for no one. He dressed quickly, pulling on a clean but faded shirt and jeans, laced up his sneakers, and grabbed his cap. Downstairs, his bicycle leaned against the railing, its frame worn but reliable. Malcolm secured the empty basket to the front, then pedaled off into the still dark streets. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and faint hints of the day's first cooking fires from nearby homes. His first stop was always Hank Pryor's bakery. Hank, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, greeted Malcolm with a grin as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the warmth from the ovens embraced him, and the aroma of fresh bread was like a comforting hug. "Morning, Malcolm," Hank said, sliding a tray of steaming loaves onto the counter. "Morning, Mr. Pryor," Malcolm replied, his voice steady but cheerful. Hank handed over the basket filled with bread, carefully wrapped in brown paper. "You've got a busy route today," he said. "Got a few new customers added to the list." Malcolm nodded, lifting the basket onto his bike. "I'll make sure everyone gets their delivery on time." As he pedaled into the growing light of dawn, Malcolm's thoughts wandered. Delivering bread wasn't just a job for him. It was a way to connect with people, to understand their struggles, and to bring a moment of comfort to their lives. The golden morning sun began to warm the streets of Atlanta, casting a soft glow on the modest homes and bustling sidewalks. Malcolm Bennett pedaled steadily, the creak of his bicycle blending into the distant hum of the city waking up. His basket, carefully tied to the front of his bike, was filled with bread freshly baked by Hank Pryor. But today was no ordinary day for Malcolm. It was Saturday, his favorite day of the week. Every Saturday, Malcolm set aside a small portion of his earnings to buy a few extra loaves of bread. These loaves weren't meant for the customers on his route. They were reserved for those whose lives had fallen through the cracks of society. It was his quiet way of giving back, a gesture that, while small, carried great meaning. As he approached the park, Malcolm slowed his bike and glanced at the familiar figure of Mrs. Eunice Walker. The elderly woman sat on her usual bench, her shoulders hunched against the cool breeze, a thin scarf barely keeping the chill at bay. Malcolm stopped and dismounted, pulling out a loaf from the basket. This wasn't a delivery, it was one of the loaves he had bought with his own money. "Good morning, Mrs. Eunice," Malcolm said warmly, handing her the bread. Her tired eyes lit up as she accepted it with trembling hands. "Malcolm, you shouldn't be spending your money like this," she said, though her gratitude was evident in her tone. "It's nothing, Mrs. Eunice," Malcolm replied, crouching to meet her gaze. "You deserve to have something warm to eat." She held the loaf close, her voice soft but full of emotion. "You don't have much yourself, yet you still do this for me. Why, Malcolm? Why do you go out of your way for someone like me?" Malcolm hesitated for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Because when my mother was alive, she always told me to take care of those who needed it most. She said that even when we don't have much, we always have something to give." Mrs. Eunice nodded, her eyes glistening. "Your mother raised a good man, Malcolm. Don't let this world take that kindness from you." Malcolm stood and adjusted his cap, giving her a small wave before returning to his bike. As he pedaled away, he thought of his mother and the sacrifices she had made for him. Her memory was a constant source of strength, guiding him even on the hardest days. By the time Malcolm reached the next stop on his route, the bakery's fresh bread was already brightening the lives of its customers. At the corner of Washington and Pine, he stopped in front of a modest blue house. Mrs. Andrews, a kind woman in her 60s, greeted him warmly. Her grandson Noah ran out with the boundless energy of a child, his curls bouncing as he rushed to meet Malcolm. "Mr. Malcolm, did you bring the rolls I like?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Malcolm chuckled as he handed over the bag. "Of course, Noah. I made sure they were packed just for you." Mrs. Andrews shook her head with a smile. "You spoil him, Malcolm. He looks forward to seeing you more than anything else all week." "It's no trouble, Mrs. Andrews," Malcolm replied. "I'm just glad he's enjoying them." As he waved goodbye and pedaled to his next stop, Malcolm felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. His job wasn't glamorous, and his life wasn't easy, but moments like these reminded him of the importance of connection. As Malcolm pedaled through the bustling streets, the city was now fully awake. Cars honked as commuters rushed to their destinations, and vendors set up their stalls, their chatter filling the air. Malcolm's basket was noticeably lighter now, with just a few loaves left. His next stop was the church at the edge of his route, where a soup kitchen operated every Saturday morning. The church's modest brick exterior seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, and the faint sound of hymns echoed from inside. Malcolm parked his bike and carefully removed the last loaves from his basket, walking them to the side door, where Miss Geneva, the soup kitchen's head volunteer, was busy organizing supplies. "Malcolm!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up as she saw him approach. Right on time, as always, Malcolm handed her the bread with a smile. "Morning, Miss Geneva. Hope these help." She accepted the loaves, her hands calloused from years of hard work. "You have no idea how much this means to us," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Every loaf goes a long way around here. You're a blessing, Malcolm." Malcolm shrugged modestly. "Just doing my part." Miss Geneva paused, looking at him with a mix of admiration and concern. "You're always giving so much to others, but are you taking care of yourself? You've got your whole life ahead of you, Malcolm. Don't let it wear you down." Malcolm smiled faintly, adjusting the cap on his head. "Helping others is what keeps me going, Miss Geneva. If I can make someone's day just a little bit better, then it's all worth it." Miss Geneva nodded, though her concern lingered. She had seen too many young men like Malcolm, kind, hard-working, and selfless, burn themselves out in the face of life's relentless challenges. After leaving the church, Malcolm decided to make one last stop before heading home. He turned onto a quieter street, where an old park bench sat beneath a sprawling oak tree. The bench was occupied by a young man in his early 20s, dressed in clothes that had seen better days. Malcolm recognized him, Elliot, a recent addition to the neighborhood, who had been struggling to find his footing. Malcolm parked his bike and approached with one of the loaves he had saved. "Hey, Elliot!" he called out, his tone warm but casual. Elliot looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. "Oh, hey Malcolm, what's up?" Malcolm handed him the loaf. "I thought you might be able to use this." Elliot took it cautiously, his fingers brushing the crust of the bread. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I didn't know people like you still existed." Malcolm chuckled lightly and sat down beside him. "What do you mean by that?" Elliot hesitated, then sighed. "Most people just pass by without even looking at me. It's like I don't exist. But you stop. You see me." Malcolm nodded, his gaze steady. "I know what it feels like to be overlooked. My mother used to say, if you see someone struggling, don't look away, step up. She lived by that, and I try to do the same." Elliot swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "I'm trying to get back on my feet," he admitted. "It's just hard, you know? But maybe I can try harder." "You've already started," Malcolm said, his voice filled with quiet encouragement. "One step at a time, Elliot. You'll get there." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city fading into the background. For Malcolm, this wasn't just about giving bread, it was about giving hope. As the sun reached its peak, Malcolm finally returned home, his basket now empty, but his heart full. He climbed the creaky stairs to his apartment, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The small space greeted him with its familiar simplicity: a bed, a table, and the single photograph of his mother on the dresser. He walked over to the photo and picked it up, tracing the edges of the frame with his thumb. "Another Saturday, Mom," he murmured, his voice soft. "I hope I'm making you proud." Setting the photo back down, Malcolm sat by the window, gazing out at the neighborhood below. Children still played on the street, their laughter echoing through the air. A sense of calm settled over him. He didn't have much, but what he had, he gave freely, and that was enough. The following Monday, Malcolm Bennett resumed his routine, pedaling through Atlanta's bustling streets as the city buzzed with activity. But Monday mornings carried a different weight compared to the tranquil Saturdays. These mornings were hurried, filled with the impatient honking of cars and the occasional sharp word exchanged by stressed commuters. As Malcolm approached his first stop, a quaint corner cafe called Sonny's, he noticed a small commotion just outside the door. A young boy, no older than 10, stood with his face pressed against the window, gazing longingly at the pastries on display inside. His clothes were worn, his shoes frayed at the edges, and his hands tucked tightly under his armpits to ward off the morning chill. Malcolm parked his bike and approached the boy. "Hey there, you okay?" he asked gently. The boy startled, his wide eyes darting toward Malcolm. I wasn't doing anything," he stammered, stepping back. "It's all right," Malcolm said, his tone steady and reassuring. "You hungry?" The boy hesitated before nodding slightly. Malcolm reached into his basket, pulling out a smaller loaf he had set aside for situations just like this. He handed it to the boy with a small smile. "Here, take this," Malcolm said. The boy's eyes lit up as he accepted the bread, clutching it tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Malcolm could ask his name, the boy darted off down the street, disappearing into the crowd. Inside Sonny's, the smell of fresh coffee and pastries wrapped around him like a warm hug. Jared Fulton, Malcolm's energetic co-worker, was already waiting for him at the counter. "You're late," Jared exclaimed, grinning as he waved Malcolm over. "Get held up solving the world's problems again?" Malcolm chuckled as he began unloading the bread for the cafe's daily order. "Just doing what I can," he replied, his voice modest. Jared leaned in conspiratorially. "I don't know how you do it, man. If I were in your shoes, I'd probably keep my head down and focus on myself. People out there, they're not always kind, you know?" Malcolm paused, looking up at Jared with a quiet determination in his eyes. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but if everyone kept their heads down, who'd be left to look out for the people who need it?" Jared's grin faded slightly as he considered Malcolm's words. He respected Malcolm deeply, but sometimes he couldn't understand how his friend remained so calm in the face of the injustices they both encountered. Later that morning, Malcolm's route took him to a more upscale part of town, a stark contrast to the vibrant but humble neighborhoods he usually rode through. The streets here were lined with pristine sidewalks and towering townhouses, each one a picture of wealth and comfort. At one stop, he parked his bike outside an elegant home and carefully lifted the bread order from his basket. Just as he approached the door, a middle-aged man stepped out, his expression immediately shifting to one of suspicion. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone clipped and formal. Malcolm held up the bread, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. "Just here with your delivery, sir." The man's eyes flicked to Malcolm's worn clothes, his frayed sneakers, and the bike resting by the curb. "You're the delivery guy?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. "Yes, sir," Malcolm replied simply, handing over the bread. The man hesitated before taking the package, his gaze lingering on Malcolm for a moment longer than necessary. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the house, the door shutting firmly behind him. Malcolm exhaled softly as he returned to his bike. He was used to moments like this, where a single glance was enough for someone to make assumptions about him, but no matter how many times it happened, it never got easier. As he pedaled away, he heard a voice call out from across the street. "Hey, Malcolm!" He turned to see Caleb Rivers, a lanky teenager who often hung out near the park, waving at him. Malcolm stopped, a smile breaking across his face. "Caleb," he greeted, "what's up?" The boy jogged over, his face lighting up with excitement. "Just wanted to say thanks," Caleb said, his voice earnest. "For the bread you gave me last week. My mom said to tell you it really helped." Malcolm placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Tell your mom she doesn't need to thank me. I'm just glad you both got what you needed." Caleb nodded, his expression serious. "You're a good guy, Malcolm. Not many people would do what you do." Malcolm shrugged, but the warmth in his chest was undeniable. "Just trying to do my part, Caleb. That's all any of us can do." As Malcolm rode off, he couldn't help but think about how interconnected they all were. Him, Caleb, the young boy at Sonny's, even the man who had looked at him with such suspicion. Every interaction, every small gesture, rippled outward in ways he couldn't always see. And that thought gave him hope. The next stop on Malcolm's route was Hank Pryor's bakery, a familiar haven where the smell of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the air. Malcolm parked his bike outside and stepped into the warm, bustling space. Hank, as usual, was behind the counter, sliding a tray of croissants into the display case. "Malcolm!" Hank greeted with his booming voice. "You're running a little behind today, aren't you?" Malcolm chuckled, brushing the morning chill from his jacket. "Had a few extra stops along the way. You know how it is?" Hank shook his head with a knowing smile. "Let me guess, handing out bread to those who need it more than you do?" Malcolm shrugged modestly. "It's just a couple of loaves, Mr. Pryor. Nothing too big." Hank leaned over the counter, his expression softening. "It's more than nothing, Malcolm. It's everything to the people you help. Don't downplay it." Malcolm nodded, accepting the compliment without letting it inflate him. He loaded his basket with the next batch of deliveries, but as he turned to leave, Hank called out again. "Hey, Malcolm," Hank said, his tone turning serious. "You're a good kid, but don't let the world take advantage of you. Kindness is rare these days, but you've got to protect your heart too." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Thanks, Mr. Pryor. I'll keep that in mind." Malcolm's next delivery was to a small family diner near the edge of downtown. The owner, a cheerful woman named Miss Loretta, greeted him warmly as he brought in the day's bread. "Morning, Malcolm," she said, her hands dusted with flour from kneading dough. "You're always a sight for sore eyes. These streets can use more folks like you." Malcolm placed the bread on the counter, his usual calm smile in place. "Just doing my part, Miss Loretta. How's business today?" She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's steady, but the regulars have been tighter with their wallets lately. Times are tough, you know?" Malcolm nodded. He understood all too well. Life had been hard for everyone, and small businesses like Miss Loretta's diner often bore the brunt of it. Before he could respond, the door jingled as a new customer entered. Malcolm turned to see a tall man in a sharp suit, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. The man glanced briefly at Malcolm, his expression unreadable, before approaching the counter. "Excuse me," the man said to Miss Loretta, his tone polite but curt. "I'd like a coffee to go." Miss Loretta nodded and began preparing the order. Meanwhile, the man's gaze shifted back to Malcolm, lingering on his worn clothes and scuffed sneakers. "You're the delivery guy?" the man asked, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. Malcolm turned to him, keeping his tone neutral. "That's right." The man studied him for a moment, longer, before nodding slightly, as if Malcolm's presence had answered an unspoken question. "Well, good for you," he said finally, though his words felt more like a dismissal than praise. Malcolm chose not to respond, instead thanking Miss Loretta and stepping outside to continue his route. By mid-afternoon, Malcolm's deliveries were nearly finished, and he decided to make a brief stop at the park before heading home. The park was alive with activity. Children ran across the grass, couples strolled hand in hand, and a street performer strummed his guitar near the fountain. Malcolm found a quiet spot beneath a sprawling oak tree, parking his bike and sitting on the bench to catch his breath. As he sat, a familiar voice called out to him. "Malcolm!" He turned to see Jared Fulton approaching, his ever-present grin lighting up his face. Jared plopped down beside him, a paper bag of snacks in hand. "Man, you've been all over today," Jared said, handing Malcolm a bottle of water. "You need to slow down before you burn out." Malcolm accepted the water with a grateful nod. "It's been a busy one, but nothing I can't handle." Jared leaned back against the bench, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know, I don't get how you do it," he said. "You're out here busting your back for people who don't always appreciate it. Don't you ever get tired of trying to make a difference?" Malcolm took a long sip of water before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But it's not about whether they appreciate it or not. It's about knowing I did what I could." Jared frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Yeah, but what about you, man? Don't you ever feel like the world's just unfair?" Malcolm met his gaze, his voice steady. "It is unfair, but if I let that stop me, what's the point? Someone's gotta try, Jared. Might as well be me." Jared shook his head with a small laugh. "You're a better man than me, Malcolm, that's for sure." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Malcolm said goodbye to Jared and headed back to his bike. His basket was nearly empty now, save for one loaf he had saved for Caleb Rivers, the teenager he'd met earlier that week. When he reached the park's edge, he spotted Caleb sitting on a bench, scrolling through his phone. Malcolm approached with the loaf in hand, calling out to him. "Hey, Caleb!" The boy looked up, his face breaking into a grin. "Malcolm, what's up?" Malcolm handed him the bread. "Just thought you might need this." Caleb accepted it with a sheepish smile. "Thanks, man. You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Malcolm said simply. "You doing all right?" Caleb nodded, though his expression turned a bit serious. "Yeah, I'm good. Just trying to figure stuff out, you know?" Malcolm sat beside him. "Figuring stuff out is half the battle," he said. "You'll get there. Just keep moving forward." Caleb nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thanks, Malcolm. You're a real one." Malcolm smiled. "Anytime, Caleb." As the day wound down, Malcolm Bennett made his final delivery at a small grocery store on the edge of the neighborhood. He parked his bike next to a row of shopping carts and grabbed the last few loaves from his basket. Inside, the store bustled with activity. Customers filled their baskets, employees restocked shelves, and the faint hum of conversation filled the air. The store manager, Mr. Harris, greeted Malcolm at the counter. "Ah, Malcolm, just in time," he said, glancing at his watch. "Got a little busy here today." Malcolm nodded politely as he handed over the bread. "Glad I could make it. Anything else you need for the week?" Mr. Harris shook his head. "Nope, we're all set. Appreciate you always being on time, Malcolm. It makes a big difference." Malcolm smiled, thankful for the brief moment of recognition. As he headed back outside, he felt the weight of the day begin to settle on his shoulders. His work was nearly done, but the echoes of the interactions he'd had lingered in his mind. On his way home, Malcolm decided to stop at the park again. The sprawling space was quieter now, with fewer children and couples lingering as the evening approached. He found himself drawn to the bench where he'd first spoken with Caleb, hoping to catch the young man before the day ended. Sure enough, Caleb was there, sitting with his head bowed and his phone in his hands. Malcolm approached, calling out softly, "Hey, Caleb." The teenager looked up, his face lighting up at the sight of Malcolm. "Hey, what's up?" Malcolm sat down beside him, noticing the slight tension in Caleb's posture. "You okay? You look like you've got something on your mind." Caleb hesitated, then shrugged. "Just life, I guess." My mom's working double shifts and we're still barely making rent. I've been trying to find a job, but no one's hiring a kid like me." Malcolm nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's tough out there, no doubt about it. But don't sell yourself short, Caleb. You're smart, hardworking. You've got a lot to offer." Caleb gave a weak smile. "Thanks, man. I just wish things were easier, you know?" "I know," Malcolm said quietly. "But sometimes, the hardest roads lead to the best places. You've just got to keep going." Caleb looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of doubt and hope. "You really think I'll get there?" Malcolm smiled. "I know you will, and if you ever need a hand, you know where to find me." The two sat in silence for a moment, the cool evening air settling around them. For Malcolm, moments like this reminded him of why he did what he did. It wasn't just about delivering bread. It was about connecting, offering hope, and being a steady presence in a world that often felt uncertain. As Malcolm prepared to leave the park, he noticed a woman standing near the fountain, her gaze fixed on him. She was dressed simply, but neatly, with a tote bag slung over her shoulder. Malcolm felt a flicker of curiosity as she approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm but measured. "Are you Malcolm Bennett?" Malcolm nodded cautiously. "That's me. Can I help you?" The woman extended her hand. "Amanda Whitmore. I've heard a lot about you." Malcolm shook her hand, his brow furrowed slightly. "From who?" Amanda smiled. "Miss Geneva at the church. She's mentioned you a few times, about how you're always helping out, delivering bread, giving to those in need." Malcolm felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. "It's nothing, really. Just trying to do my part." Amanda studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You're being modest, but that's okay. I work with a nonprofit organization that helps individuals like you, people who give so much to their communities without asking for anything in return." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "Why would someone like me need help?" "Because you're doing incredible work, but I imagine it's not easy," Amanda said. "Our organization provides resources to people like you, to make it easier for you to keep making a difference." Malcolm hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of help. His entire life had been about giving. But as he looked into Amanda's sincere eyes, he felt a flicker of possibility. "What kind of resources?" he asked cautiously. "Funding, connections, support," Amanda replied. "Whatever you need to take what you're doing to the next level." Malcolm considered her words carefully. "I don't know. I've never really thought about doing anything bigger than what I'm already doing." "That's okay," Amanda said gently. "Just think about it. You don't have to decide right now." She handed him a card with her contact information. "If you ever want to talk, give me a call. No pressure." Malcolm took the card, his mind racing with thoughts he hadn't entertained before. As Amanda walked away, he stood by his bike, staring at the small piece of paper in his hand. Could this be an opportunity to do more, to reach more people? The idea both excited and intimidated him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Malcolm rode home, the streets now quiet under the blanket of twilight. His apartment welcomed him with its familiar simplicity, but tonight, it felt different. There was a new energy in the air, a sense that something was shifting. Sitting by the window, he pulled out Amanda's card and set it on the table. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like it might hold something more. The upscale neighborhood was a stark contrast to the streets Malcolm usually rode through. The manicured lawns, pristine driveways, and towering homes painted a picture of comfort and privilege that felt worlds away from the modest, bustling communities he called home. This was one of his newer delivery routes, and though the orders were fewer, the pay helped cover the rising cost of his rent. Malcolm pedaled cautiously down the smooth pavement, his basket neatly packed with the final loaves for the day. His next stop was a tall brick townhouse with white shutters and an ornate front door. He parked his bike by the curb, straightened his cap, and retrieved the bread order from the basket. As he approached the house, the door swung open, and a man in his 50s stepped out, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. His phone was pressed to his ear, and his expression was one of practiced authority. When his eyes landed on Malcolm, a flicker of confusion crossed his face before it hardened into something colder. "Can I help you?" the man asked curtly, lowering his phone. Malcolm offered a polite smile, holding up the bag of bread. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm here with your delivery." The man's gaze swept over Malcolm, lingering on his worn sneakers and the bike resting by the curb, his lips pressed into a thin line. Is this some kind of joke? Malcolm blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Bread delivery? The man repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. Do you even work for the bakery, or is this some kind of scam? The words stung, but Malcolm kept his composure. I assure you, sir, I'm just here to deliver your order. If you'd like, I can show you the receipt. I don't need a receipt, the man snapped, cutting him off. I need you to leave, now. Malcolm's chest tightened, but he stayed calm. Sir, I'm only trying to do my job. Before either of them could say another word, a woman's voice interrupted. Is there a problem here? Both men turned to see Amanda Whitmore standing a few steps away, a tote bag slung over her shoulder. She had been walking her usual route when she noticed the tense exchange. Her sharp eyes flicked between Malcolm and the man, taking in the situation instantly. I was just leaving, Malcolm said quickly, not wanting to escalate the confrontation. No, you're not, Amanda said firmly, stepping closer. She turned to the man, her expression calm but unyielding. This young man is clearly doing his job. Why are you giving him a hard time? The man bristled, his cheeks flushing. It's not your concern, ma'am. Oh, but it is, Amanda replied smoothly. Because I've been watching you, and it seems to me that the only issue here is that you've made a snap judgment about someone who doesn't look like you. Am I wrong? The man sputtered, his composure faltering. That's not what this is about. Then take your bread, Amanda said, her tone pointed, and let him do his job. For a moment, the man stood frozen, his pride and embarrassment warring on his face. Finally, he snatched the bag from Malcolm's hands without another word and retreated into the house, slamming the door behind him. Malcolm exhaled slowly, relief mingling with lingering frustration. He turned to Amanda, unsure of what to say. Thank you, he said quietly. Amanda gave him a small smile. No need to thank me. I just can't stand by and watch things like that happen. She extended her hand. I'm Amanda Whitmore. Malcolm Bennett, he replied, shaking her hand. Nice to meet you, Malcolm, Amanda said. She glanced at his bike and the now empty basket. Do you have a few minutes? There's a cafe down the street. My treat. Malcolm hesitated, glancing at the setting sun. He still needed to head home, but something in Amanda's genuine demeanor made him pause. Sure, he said finally. I can spare a few minutes. The cafe Amanda led him to was cozy, with warm lighting and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. They found a quiet corner, and Amanda ordered 2 cups of coffee before sitting across from Malcolm. So, Amanda began, folding her hands on the table. What's your story? Malcolm blinked, caught off guard. My story? Yes, Amanda said with a smile. You're clearly a hard worker, but there's more to you than just delivering bread, isn't there? Malcolm hesitated, unsure how much to share. There's not much to tell, he said modestly. I grew up around here, just me and my mom. She worked hard to make sure I had what I needed, even when things got tough. Amanda nodded, her expression thoughtful. And now you're doing the same for others. Malcolm shrugged. I just try to help where I can. A loaf of bread might not seem like much, but sometimes it's enough to make someone's day a little easier. Amanda studied him for a moment, her eyes searching. You're humble, Malcolm, but don't downplay what you're doing. It matters. He looked away, a faint flush creeping up his neck. I'm just doing what feels right. Amanda smiled softly. That's exactly why I want to help you. Malcolm frowned slightly, confused. Help me how? I work for a nonprofit organization, Amanda explained. We support people like you, those who give so much to their communities without expecting anything in return. We provide resources to help you reach even more people. Malcolm was quiet for a moment, her words sinking in. I've never thought about doing anything bigger than what I'm already doing. That's okay, Amanda said gently. But I think you could. And if you're interested, I'd like to help you figure out how. She handed him her card, her smile encouraging. No pressure, just think about it. Malcolm stared at the card for a moment before slipping it into his pocket. Thanks, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Amanda nodded. You're doing something special, Malcolm. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Malcolm left the cafe with Amanda's business card tucked carefully into his pocket. As he pedaled home, the events of the day played over in his mind. The sharp words from the man in the upscale neighborhood still lingered, a bitter reminder of how often people judged him before they knew him. Yet, Amanda's kindness had cut through the sting of that encounter. The thought of her offer weighed heavily on him. He had never considered expanding what he did into something larger. His life had always been about small acts of kindness, enough to make a difference in someone's day, but not so much that it drew attention. The idea of accepting help, of growing beyond his quiet efforts, both excited and terrified him. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The familiar creak of the stairs greeted him as he climbed to his small, tidy home. Inside, the photo of his mother on the dresser seemed to watch over him, her soft smile a constant source of encouragement. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, Amanda's card in his hand. He traced the embossed letters with his thumb, her words echoing in his mind. "You're doing something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He exhaled deeply and set the card down. Tomorrow, he thought. He'd think about it more tomorrow. The next morning, Malcolm's routine began as usual. The hum of the city woke alongside him as he made his deliveries, weaving through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. But the thought of Amanda's offer lingered in the back of his mind, distracting him. His route eventually brought him back to Hank Pryor's bakery. The warmth of the ovens and the scent of fresh bread enveloped him as he walked inside. But today, Hank noticed something different about Malcolm. "Morning, Malcolm," Hank said, handing over the day's orders. "You all right? You seem a little off." Malcolm hesitated, then shrugged. "Just got a lot on my mind, I guess." Hank leaned on the counter, his expression softening. "Anything you want to talk about?" For a moment, Malcolm considered brushing it off. But Hank had always been more than just an employer. He was a mentor, someone who believed in Malcolm when few others did. "There's this woman I met yesterday," Malcolm began, carefully choosing his words. "She works for a nonprofit and says they help people like me, people who want to give back to their communities." Hank raised an eyebrow. "And you're not sure if you want to take her up on it?" Malcolm nodded. "It's just, I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. I've always done things quietly, helping where I can, but keeping it simple." Hank studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Malcolm, sometimes keeping it simple is the best way to start. But if you've got the chance to make a bigger difference, why not take it? You're already doing more than most people ever will." Malcolm looked down at the bag of bread in his hands, Hank's words resonating with him. "I just don't want to get in over my head," he admitted. "You won't," Hank said firmly. "You've got a good heart, Malcolm. That'll guide you." Later that afternoon, Malcolm made a stop at the park to clear his head. The sprawling oak trees and soft chatter of families created a sense of calm, but Malcolm's thoughts were still restless. As he sat on a bench, his bike parked nearby, Caleb Rivers approached, a grin spreading across his face when he saw Malcolm. "Hey man," Caleb called out, jogging over. "Hey Caleb," Malcolm replied, smiling despite himself. Caleb plopped down beside him, his usual energy bubbling over. "What's up? You look like you're deep in thought." Malcolm hesitated, then chuckled softly. "You could say that. I've got a decision to make, and I'm not sure what to do." "What kind of decision?" Caleb asked, his curiosity piqued. Malcolm explained the situation briefly, keeping it simple. Caleb listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds like a no-brainer to me," Caleb said when Malcolm finished. "You've been helping people forever. If this lady wants to help you do more of that, why not go for it?" "It's not that simple," Malcolm said. "It's a big step. What if I mess it up?" Caleb shrugged. "So what? You've been helping people one way or another for years, right? This is just the next step." Malcolm smiled, Caleb's enthusiasm infectious. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Of course I'm right," Caleb said, grinning. "You've got this, Malcolm. Don't overthink it." That evening, Malcolm found himself back at his kitchen table, Amanda's card once again in his hands. Caleb's words echoed in his mind, alongside Hank's advice and Amanda's encouragement. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the card. It rang twice before Amanda's voice answered, warm and confident. "This is Amanda Whitmore." "Hi, Amanda. It's Malcolm Bennett," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "Malcolm," Amanda said, her tone brightening. "I was hoping you'd call. How are you?" "I'm good," Malcolm replied. "I've been thinking about what you said. about how I could do more. Amanda's smile was audible in her voice. I'm glad to hear that. Why don't we meet up again? I'd love to talk about some ideas. Okay, Malcolm said, nodding to himself. Let's do it. The following morning, Malcolm met Amanda at a quiet cafe on the edge of downtown. This time, the atmosphere felt different. Not just because he had made the call, but because for the first time in years, he was considering the possibility of something bigger. Amanda was already seated when he arrived, a notebook open in front of her, and a warm smile on her face. Malcolm, she greeted, rising to shake his hand. I'm so glad you could make it. Thanks for inviting me, Malcolm said, sitting across from her. The waiter brought over 2 cups of coffee, and Amanda wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. So, she began, you've been doing a lot of incredible work, helping people in ways that go beyond what most people ever think to do. But tell me, Malcolm, if resources weren't an issue, what would you want to do? Malcolm hesitated, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. Honestly, I've always dreamed of opening a place where anyone could come and get something to eat no matter what. A place that doesn't judge you by how much money you have or what you look like. Just a place that feels like home. Amanda's eyes lit up. That's a beautiful vision. Do you have any idea how rare it is for someone to think like that? Most people would be focused on what they could gain, but you're thinking about what you can give. That's what makes you special. Malcolm looked down, a faint flush creeping up his neck. It's not about being special, it's just something my mom used to say. She always believed that if you have enough to share, you should. I guess I just try to live by that. Amanda nodded, her smile softening. It sounds like your mom was a remarkable woman. She was, Malcolm said, his voice quieter now. She worked so hard to make sure I never felt like we were missing out, even when we didn't have much. And when she passed, I guess I just felt like it was my turn to carry on what she started. Amanda reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. Malcolm, I know this might feel overwhelming, but you have what it takes to make this dream a reality. My organization can help you with funding, mentorship, and even finding a location. You don't have to do this alone. Malcolm stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. That's okay, Amanda said, pulling her notebook closer. That's what I'm here for. Let's start small. Tell me about the people you'd want to help. Who are they? What do they need? The conversation flowed easily as Malcolm opened up about his vision. He spoke about the people he had met over the years, Mrs. Eunice Walker, who relied on the bread he delivered to get through her days, Caleb Rivers, who was trying to support his mother while finding his own way, and even the strangers he encountered on the street, whose gratitude for a simple loaf of bread reminded him why he kept going. Amanda took notes, her pen moving swiftly across the page. You've already built something incredible without even realizing it, she said. You've created a network of people who trust you, who believe in what you're doing. That's a powerful foundation to build on. Malcolm nodded slowly. But what if I fail? What if I let all of them down? Amanda leaned forward, her gaze steady. Failure isn't the end, Malcolm. It's part of the process. And with the kind of heart you have, I don't think failure is something you need to worry about. You're already doing the hard part, showing up day after day and making a difference. The rest is just details. By the end of their meeting, Amanda had outlined a plan that felt both ambitious and achievable. They would start small, using funds from her organization to set up a pilot program, a temporary space where Malcolm could distribute food to those in need while building connections with the local community. You'll need a team, Amanda said as they wrapped up. Volunteers, people who believe in your mission. Do you have anyone in mind? Malcolm thought for a moment, then smiled. Yeah, I know a few people who'd want to be part of this. Amanda smiled back, closing her notebook. Good, let's make it happen. As they stood to leave, Amanda extended her hand again. You're about to do something amazing, Malcolm. I'm proud to be part of it. Malcolm shook her hand, the nervousness in his chest giving way to a quiet determination. Thank you, Amanda, for believing in me. Always, Amanda replied. Later that evening, Malcolm found himself back at the park, sitting on the same bench where he often stopped to catch his breath. The weight of the day felt different now, less like a burden and more like a challenge he was ready to face. He pulled out his phone and called Caleb, who answered on the second ring. Hey Malcolm, what's up? Caleb's voice was bright, as always. "I need your help," Malcolm said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "With what?" Malcolm leaned back against the bench, staring up at the sky. "Something big. Meet me tomorrow, and I'll tell you everything." Caleb laughed. "All right, man, I'm in." As Malcolm hung up, he felt the weight of possibility settle over him. For the first time, his dream didn't feel like a distant hope. It felt real, tangible, and within reach. He glanced at the photo of his mother on his phone's lock screen, her warm smile looking back at him. "I hope I'm making you proud, Mom," he whispered. And for the first time in a long while, he believed he was. The first steps toward Malcolm Bennett's dream began with Amanda Whitmore's unwavering support. True to her word, she connected him with a local nonprofit that specialized in helping community-driven entrepreneurs. The organization, aptly named Roots of Hope, was impressed by Malcolm's story and his commitment to making a difference. During their initial meeting, Malcolm shared his vision: a small bakery that would serve as a hub for kindness, offering fresh bread to anyone in need without judgment. The board members listened intently, and by the end of the meeting, they had pledged seed funding to help him get started. "I told you," Amanda said with a smile as they left the meeting. "When people see your heart, they can't help but want to be part of what you're building." Still, Malcolm knew money wasn't the only thing he needed. Running a bakery required skills he hadn't fully mastered, and for that, he turned to the person who had been quietly supporting him for years, Hank Pryor. One evening, Malcolm stopped by Hank's bakery after his usual deliveries. The familiar warmth of the shop enveloped him as he walked in, the smell of cinnamon rolls and sourdough bread filling the air. Hank looked up from the counter, his face breaking into a grin. "Malcolm, what brings you by this late?" "I need your help," Malcolm said, his voice steady but earnest. Hank raised an eyebrow, leaning on the counter. "What kind of help?" Malcolm explained his plan, outlining the idea for a small bakery where kindness would be baked into every loaf. Hank listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Well," Hank said after a moment, "you've got the passion, that's for sure. But running a bakery isn't just about making bread. It's about timing, consistency, and keeping up with demand. Are you ready for all that?" Malcolm nodded. "I don't know everything yet, but I'm willing to learn, and I can't think of anyone better to teach me than you." Hank chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "All right, kid, I'll help you. But don't think I'm going to go easy on you. If you're serious about this, you're going to have to work harder than you ever have." "Whatever it takes," Malcolm said, determination clear in his voice. Over the next few months, Malcolm split his time between his delivery job and training at Hank's bakery. He learned how to knead dough to the perfect consistency, how to balance flavors, and how to keep a kitchen running smoothly during the busiest hours. Hank was a patient but demanding teacher, pushing Malcolm to refine his skills and think like a business owner. "You've got the heart," Hank said one day as they pulled a tray of golden loaves from the oven. "Now you've got the hands, the rest will come with time." Meanwhile, Amanda worked behind the scenes to secure a location for Malcolm's bakery. After weeks of searching, she found the perfect spot, a small corner space in Malcolm's neighborhood, just a few blocks from the park where he often stopped to reflect. The building was modest but full of potential, with a cozy interior and a large window that let in plenty of natural light. When Malcolm saw the space for the first time, he felt a lump rise in his throat. It wasn't just a building, it was the beginning of something that felt bigger than himself. "This is it," he said softly, turning to Amanda. "It's all yours," Amanda replied, handing him the keys. The grand opening of Malcolm's bakery, which he named Hope Bakery, was a modest but heartfelt event. The grand opening of Malcolm's bakery, which he named Hope Bakery, was a modest but heartfelt event. The small space buzzed with activity as friends, neighbors, and supporters gathered to celebrate. Caleb Rivers was there, wearing an apron and helping to hand out bread. Miss Geneva from the soup kitchen brought a group of volunteers to show their support. Even Mrs. Eunice Walker, frail but determined, sat in a chair near the counter, a proud smile on her face. Malcolm stood behind the counter, overwhelmed by the turnout. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, addressing the crowd. "This bakery isn't just about bread, it's about people, about making sure everyone knows they matter, no matter what they're going through. Thank you for believing in me." The applause was thunderous, but it was the individual faces in the crowd that stayed with Malcolm. The people he had helped over the years, now gathered to celebrate this new chapter in his life. In the weeks that followed, Hope Bakery quickly became a fixture in the community. Malcolm worked tirelessly to balance running the business with maintaining the heart of his mission. For every loaf sold, another was set aside for someone in need. One day, as Malcolm handed a bag of bread to a man who had been living on the streets, the man paused and looked at him with tears in his eyes. "You don't know what this means to me," he said. Malcolm smiled, his voice steady. "I think I do." As the man walked away, Caleb, who had become Malcolm's unofficial right-hand helper, approached. "You know," Caleb said, grinning, "this place is more than a bakery. It's like a second home for people." "That's the idea," Malcolm replied, pride shining in his eyes. As the weeks turned into months, Hope Bakery became more than just a business. It became a cornerstone of the community. Malcolm's simple yet powerful mission of kindness resonated with people from all walks of life. Word spread quickly about the bakery's Pay It Forward wall, where customers could buy an extra loaf for someone in need. Slips of paper, each representing a pre-purchased loaf, fluttered gently on a corkboard near the counter. Anyone who couldn't afford to pay could simply take a slip and exchange it for fresh bread, no questions asked. One Saturday morning, as Malcolm kneaded dough in the back of the bakery, Caleb burst into the kitchen, his face alight with excitement. "Malcolm!" he called, barely able to contain himself. Malcolm looked up, startled. "What's going on?" "There's a line outside," Caleb said, grinning. "Like a huge line. People are waiting around the block." Malcolm wiped his hands on his apron and stepped into the front of the shop. Sure enough, the sidewalk was packed with people, some holding tote bags, others chatting warmly as they waited their turn. Amanda Whitmore stood near the entrance, her sharp eye taking in the scene. When she spotted Malcolm, she waved him over. "Looks like you've started something incredible," she said, gesturing to the crowd. Malcolm shook his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "I never thought it would get this big." Amanda smiled. "That's the thing about kindness, it's contagious." As Hope Bakery grew, so did its impact. People who had once been on the receiving end of Malcolm's generosity began returning to pay it forward in their own ways. Mrs. Eunice Walker, whose health had improved slightly, visited the bakery regularly, sharing stories with customers and offering words of encouragement to anyone who needed them. "You've turned this place into something special," she told Malcolm one day as she sat by the window, watching the steady stream of patrons. "It's not just me," Malcolm replied, glancing at Caleb, who was busy helping a customer. "It's everyone." The bakery also became a place of opportunity. Caleb, who had started as a volunteer, quickly proved himself indispensable. Under Malcolm's guidance, he learned the ins and outs of running a business, from managing inventory to baking bread. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the kitchen, Malcolm turned to Caleb with a smile. "You ever think about what you want to do in the future?" Malcolm asked. Caleb shrugged, his hands deftly shaping a loaf. "Honestly, I never thought I'd have a future until I met you. But now, I think I want to keep helping people like you do." Malcolm nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "You're already doing it, Caleb, and you're good at it." A year after its opening, Hope Bakery hosted a small celebration to mark its anniversary. The event was simple but heartfelt, much like the bakery itself. Friends, neighbors, and customers gathered to reflect on the impact the bakery had made. Hank Pryor attended, his gruff exterior softening as he watched Malcolm interact with the crowd. "You've done good, kid," he said, clapping Malcolm on the shoulder. "Better than I ever could have imagined." Miss Geneva from the soup kitchen brought a group of volunteers, many of whom had benefited from Malcolm's generosity in the past. Even Amanda took a rare moment to relax, chatting with customers and marveling at how far Malcolm had come. The highlight of the celebration came when Mrs. Eunice Walker presented Malcolm with a gift, a hand-painted sign for the bakery, featuring its name and a simple tagline, "Hope is always rising." Malcolm held the sign carefully, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Eunice," he said softly. She patted his hand, her smile warm. "No, Malcolm, thank you for everything." The sign was hung proudly above the bakery's counter, where it quickly became a symbol of the community's resilience and generosity. As the celebration wound down, Malcolm stood outside the bakery, watching the last of the guests depart. The night was quiet, the air cool and crisp. Caleb joined him, leaning against the doorframe with a contented smile. You know, Caleb said, breaking the silence, this place has changed a lot of lives. Malcolm looked at him, his expression thoughtful. It's not just about the bread, is it? No, Caleb replied. It's about what the bread represents: hope, community, a chance for people to start over. Malcolm nodded, his heart full. Then, I guess we've done something right. As they stood there, the bakery behind them glowing softly in the night, Malcolm felt a deep sense of peace. His journey had been far from easy, but every struggle, every act of kindness had led to this moment, a moment where hope truly felt within reach. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Hope Bakery, bathing the small shop in light. Inside, the usual hum of activity had quieted as the last of the morning rush faded. Malcolm Bennett leaned against the counter, wiping his hands on a towel as he took a moment to reflect. Mrs. Eunice Walker sat at her favorite spot by the window, her presence as steady as ever. Her frail hands rested on a cup of tea, and her gaze was distant, lost in thought. Malcolm noticed the unusual quietness and approached her table. "You doing all right, Mrs. Eunice?" he asked, sliding into the seat across from her. She looked up, her tired eyes softening when she met his. "Just thinking, Malcolm," she said with a small smile. "It's hard not to, in a place like this." "Good thoughts, I hope," Malcolm replied, his tone light but encouraging. Mrs. Eunice chuckled softly. "Memories, mostly, of my son. You remind me so much of him, you know." Malcolm tilted his head, curious. She rarely spoke about her past. "What was he like?" "Oh, he was a dreamer," she said, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "Always talking about the things he wanted to do, the ways he wanted to help people. He had a heart just like yours." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "But the world isn't always kind to dreamers, is it?" Malcolm's chest tightened. He knew the truth of her words all too well. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying." Mrs. Eunice reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "You've made this world a little kinder, Malcolm. You've given people a reason to believe again. That's something my son would have been proud of." Her words stayed with Malcolm long after their conversation ended. Later that day, Caleb Rivers joined Malcolm in the kitchen, his energy as infectious as ever. He had become an integral part of Hope Bakery, and under Malcolm's mentorship, he was thriving. As they worked side by side, Caleb spoke up. "You know, Malcolm, I've been thinking a lot lately." "Uh-oh," Malcolm teased, grinning. "That sounds dangerous." Caleb laughed, shaking his head. "No, I'm serious. I've been thinking about what you said a while back, about figuring out what I want to do with my life, and I think I know now." Malcolm set down the dough he was shaping and turned to Caleb, his expression curious. "Yeah? What's that?" "I want to help people, like you do," Caleb said, his voice steady with conviction. "Maybe not with bread, I'm not sure yet, but I know I want to give back. You've shown me that even small things can make a big difference." Pride swelled in Malcolm's chest. "That's a good path, Caleb. Whatever you decide to do, I know you'll make a difference." "Thanks, Malcolm," Caleb said, a rare seriousness in his tone. "I wouldn't have figured it out without you." As the sun began to set, Malcolm found himself alone in the bakery. He stood by the window, watching as people passed by, some stopping to read the sign above the door, others smiling as they carried loaves of bread home. His gaze drifted to the painting that hung prominently behind the counter. It was a gift from Mrs. Eunice, a beautiful depiction of Malcolm standing in the park, handing out bread to those in need. The words, "Hope is always rising," were etched delicately along the bottom. For Malcolm, the painting wasn't just art. It was a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his mother, who had taught him the importance of kindness. He thought about Amanda Whitmore, whose belief in him had opened doors he hadn't even known existed. He thought about Hank Pryor, whose guidance had given him the skills to turn a dream into reality. Most of all, he thought about the people who had walked through the doors of Hope Bakery, each one carrying their own struggles, each one finding a moment of solace within these walls. That evening, as Malcolm locked up the bakery, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. Caleb waited outside, leaning casually against his bike. "Ready?" Caleb asked, tossing Malcolm a helmet. "Ready," Malcolm replied, climbing onto his bike. The two rode through the neighborhood together, the streets quiet in the soft glow of streetlights. As they passed the park, Malcolm slowed, his eyes drawn to the bench where he had so often stopped to rest. It felt like a lifetime ago. "You think you'll ever stop?" Caleb asked, his voice breaking the silence. Malcolm glanced at him, smiling faintly. "Stop what?" "Helping people," Caleb said. "Doing all this." Malcolm shook his head. "Number? Not as long as there's someone who needs it." Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good, because this world needs more people like you." Malcolm didn't respond, but the words stayed with him as they rode on. Malcolm's journey is a testament to the transformative power of kindness. Through his unwavering determination to give, he proved that even the smallest gestures, a loaf of bread handed to someone in need, could spark ripples of change. His story isn't just about opening a bakery, it's about opening hearts, building connections, and reminding people of the humanity we all share. Hope Bakery became more than a place for bread. It became a haven for those seeking warmth and understanding. From Mrs. Eunice Walker, who found solace in her memories, to Caleb Rivers, who discovered a purpose through Malcolm's mentorship, the bakery wasn't just a business, it was a community. Malcolm's ability to see and nurture potential in others turned Hope Bakery into a symbol of resilience, generosity, and love. As his story unfolds, we are reminded of several profound lessons. First, that small acts of kindness can create significant impacts. Malcolm didn't set out to change the world. He simply wanted to help his neighbors. Yet, in doing so, he created something extraordinary. Second, resilience in the face of adversity is key. Malcolm encountered prejudice, doubt, and obstacles at every turn, but he met them with grace and determination. Lastly, his journey shows us the power of community. Hope Bakery thrived not because of Malcolm alone, but because of the collective belief, support, and generosity of those around him. Now, we want to turn the spotlight to you, our viewers. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a small act of kindness that made a big impact on your life? What do you think it takes to build a more compassionate and inclusive community? And if you had the chance to help someone in need, how would you go about it? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Your insights and perspectives make these discussions even more meaningful. If this story of resilience and generosity inspired you, consider liking this video and sharing it with someone who might need a little hope today. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next heartwarming story. Together, let's continue spreading kindness, hope, and love, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next video.